Prayers.
Let us pray. Guide us, Lord, in all our doings with your gracious favor, and fill us with your continual help. That in all our works begun, continued, and ended in you, we may glorify your holy name, and by your mercy attain everlasting life, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Almighty God, our Heavenly Father, send forth, we beseech thee, upon thy servants who bear office in this country, the spirit of charity and justice, that they may in all things walk before thee with steadfast purpose and a single heart, and faithfully serve in their several offices, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. O Lord, our God, who art the love of justice and truth, give thy grace to our Parliament and to all who direct the affairs of our nation, and guide them by the Holy Spirit. We beseech thee, that by word and deed they may promote the well-being of our people, and set forth peace among all persons, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. The Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive them that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. And may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all now and forevermore. Amen.
The Senate is in session.
Messages from Her Excellency the President. Announcements by Your Honor.
Announcements. First of all, have an excuse for lateness from Senator Pat Paris and Senator Jerome Walcott. Minutes of our meeting of January 25th, 2023 for deferral. Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I beg to move that the aforementioned minutes be deferred.
The question is that the minutes of our meeting of January 25th, 2023 be deferred. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. In terms of further announcements, apologies for lateness from Senator Maynard, and excuses for absence from Senators Tate and Drakes.
Presentation of petitions. Presentation of papers.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I am commanded to lay the audited financial statements of the Barbados Tourism Product Authority for the years 2015 through 2020.
Reports from select committees. Questions to ministers. Request for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance. Statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries. Personal explanations. Motions relating to the business or sitting of the Senate are moved by a minister. Introduction of bills. Public business.
Public business is now the order of the day.
Order number 2, sir. Order number 2, in the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Plant Protection Bill 2023.
Minister Dr. Moreau Knight.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, on the previous occasion, when we were in this honourable chamber, we would have debated the Animal Health and Veterinary Public Health Act. And at that time, I would have noted that that act was part of a suite of legislation which would have included as well the Plant Protection Bill. And so, Mr. President, we are here this morning to consolidate government's effort really to ensure that we have a comprehensive approach to looking at the issue of animal and plant health. And as I would have indicated in that debate as well, there is a third piece that will soon be coming, which having to do with food safety. Mr. President, I want to reiterate, as I did that time, that really in the context of this particular bill, as it was with the previous piece, the act that we would have debated, it is really part of a transformative agenda for the government. Mr. President, I understand that people want to be able to see immediacy. They want to feel that what the government is doing is going to deliver direct benefits now for them, whether that results in immediate jobs, more money, lowered prices. And Mr. President, that is extremely important. And the government has been attempting to do that in a myriad of ways, Mr. President. We can speak to the support that the government provided in the context of the COVID-19 challenges and still continue to provide, Mr. President, to ensure that in particular, those that need it the most can have the necessary buffer. We know as well, Mr. President, the government signed a compact as well with the private sector in order to make sure that we can keep prices within the supermarket to a reasonable level. So, Mr. President, we are, as much as possible, attending to those things that are immediate and having to do with the direct welfare of citizens. But there are other things, Mr. President, in the context of transformation that may take a little bit longer, but are no less fundamental to addressing the critical challenges that we face as individuals and as a nation. And I want to suggest, Mr. President, that in the context of this bill and the act, as I said, that we passed before, that it is part of a long-term transformational agenda. And Mr. President, why do I say so? I think that when we talk about the issue of things like plants, that we often don't recognize how fundamental they are to our lives. Mr. President, are we aware that 80% of our diet comes from plants? And they're also responsible for 98%, Mr. President, of the oxygen that we breathe. And that, I hope, provides some context for us. It means, Mr. President, whether or not you are a meat eater like me, whether or not you are a vegetarian or strict vegan, you depend on plant material to be able to, for your food, and to be able essentially to survive. So that, Mr. President, if you use onions, which I know Barbadians do quite a lot, that is plant. If you eat rice, Mr. President, that's plant. Spinach, Mr. President, that's plants. Pumpkin, coriander, Mr. President, all plants. The fruits that we eat, they're available because of the plants. So that our entire diet and our food revolves around our ability to make sure that we can protect our plant stock. And this legislation is attempting to do so by establishing a framework for us to be able to control the introduction of pests and ensure then that we can meet international standards and be able to trade. But what this legislation also as well, Mr. President, it is directly connected to the issue of food security. And that is critical. Because we have to recognize, as I said before, the importance of plants to us and to our diet. So if you recall, Mr. President, I talked not only about the fact that plants make up 80% of the food that we eat, but are responsible for 98% of the oxygen that we breathe. So again, direct environmental impact, again, on our quality of life, Mr. President. But at the same time, we recognize that there are threats to our plant stock, which we have to make sure that we are able to mitigate and to be able to address, Mr. President. Particularly for Barbados, I want to note that 700 species of native and naturalized flowering plants have been described for Barbados. But I want to note, Mr. President, that 2 of these plant species are only found in particular wooded areas. 8 of the species are rare or endangered, and 23 species have been identified as requiring protection in Barbados. So we juxtapose that against the importance for our survival and the fact that in the context of Barbados, Mr. President, we are in danger in the context of our limited land space of losing our plant stock. They are rare and some of them are endangered. So having a comprehensive framework for the protection of our plant stock is critical for us. So that even as we say that this legislation is ensuring that we are able to trade and meet the international standards of the World Trade Organization, fundamentally, this legislation is also about protecting us, Mr. President. As we would have heard in the other place as well, there is severe risk as it relates to crop loss. The FAO actually estimates globally that up to 40% of losses occur in crop production annually, Mr. President, and they estimate that a value of $290 billion each year, Mr. President, is lost in terms of crop production, and that out of that 290 billion, 220 billion is lost because of plant diseases, and another 70 billion is lost because of invasive insect species. So if we look at the situation, Mr. President, in Barbados, limited plant stock, threats, loss in terms of crop production because of plant disease and because of insect invasion. So it means, Mr. President, that this particular bill is critical, and I reiterate it because it is important. Again, we often see these things as not having to do with our daily lives, just being legislation that is passing through the Parliament to be discussed as part of a higher level. But this has direct connection to the extent that as a country, as people, as individuals, we are able to continue to eat, Mr. President, and not having to import, because that's the important thing. If we look at it, if our plant stock becomes reduced and we are not able to maintain or preserve it, if we lose it through plant disease and insects, what do we have to do? We have to depend on imports of foreign food. Again, endangers as well our foreign currency, and as well, we have to then ask ourselves, what is the nature of the food that we will be importing? Whether it will be good for us, Mr. President, whether or not we will become then takers of what the international community decides and what perhaps we will be able to afford. So that this issue, Mr. President, is one I believe and I hope that Barbadians are paying attention to, again, because it is fundamental to us just in terms of our survival. So that, Mr. President, we established that there are a number of threats when we talk about plants and plant protection. And clearly one of those threats, Mr. President, unfortunately, is man. It's man. Because again, we don't recognize it. Our plate of food is there, we eat it, We do breakfast, we do lunch, we do dinner, and sometimes we don't often give a thought to the inputs and where the inputs come from and whether the inputs will be able to continue, so that we use and exploit the environment in ways that are not sustainable and that therefore can endanger the extent to which we are able to properly continue to have food. And so that one of the fundamental things in the context of us being able to protect our plant stock is also about protecting our genetics, the genetics material, to make sure that we will then have the genetic material to continue to restore and regenerate that lost crop production, those lost materials, particularly for plants that are endemic and natural to Barbados, Mr. President. And so in the context even of this bill, you would note that at clause 16, it provides for the establishment of a register of operators, and that register shall keep records relating to imports, exports, domestic producers, and nurseries of plants, plant products, and other regulated articles. And this is important, Mr. President, because what this will do is allow us to then be able to carefully monitor that plant stock, to carefully see what is being imported, what is being exported, because importantly, Mr. President, and we would all appreciate, one of the things about us being able to trade internationally and meet these international standards and make sure that we have the correct phytosanitary standards in place is because we don't want to import pests that can decimate our agricultural sector, and no country wants to be able to have that happen to them. So that in the context even of this register that is there at clause 16, it would allow us to make sure that we can have an ongoing monitoring of what is happening to our plant stock. What is being exported, where the plant stock is, what is happening to it, the amounts, the species, etc., and therefore allow for better management and, Mr. President, preservation, which is also critical. And there are a number of innovative things that the government is doing in the context of preserving our genetics and our plant stock. In 2022, at the end of 2022, Export Barbados launched what they call a Phyto Innovation Challenge, launched to unearth the hidden secrets of local plants. And essentially, what that was a call for Barbadians, for innovators, for housewives, men, anybody, to be able to look at the plants that we have now and then see how they can be used to address some of the fundamental challenges that are facing us as a country. So NCDs, how are we going to be able to use things? And they focus, Mr. President, on things like pink grapefruit, aloe, Barbados cherry, soursop, sea moss, bay leaf, ginger, turmeric, lemongrass, and moringa. How are we going to be able to use these plants in order then to be able to fundamentally address some of the critical social challenges facing this country? So that even in the context that we know that we have threats, the government is also then seeking to reposition as well the sector again to make sure, one, that we can preserve, but also as well in the context of initiatives like this, embed it within the local psyche by activating the creativity and the local knowledge of persons. And in the context of this challenge that was done by Export Barbados, what would happen is that the successful applicants will participate in a 6-month improvement and enhancement phase that will then seek to develop and refine their proposal towards commercialization and then hopefully for export. So scale as well, Mr. President. So preservation, but also scaling for export. I also want to indicate that if we look at what the government is doing in the context of our partnerships with Guyana and with Suriname, and in particular in Suriname in the Brokoponda agreement, one of the fundamental areas that is within that agreement is in relation to the exchange of plant material as well, Mr. President. And in particular, the Suriname, we're looking at being able to source varieties of yam, yeah? Again, to supplement our local varieties here. So that when we talk about the preservation of the genetic material, what we are doing is that where we are having varieties that may be dying off, that we cannot find, then we are able then to regenerate. And in the context of Guyana, the ministry has already received planting materials for eddos and for yams as well, and also as well for shade houses, where then we can make sure that we have facilities in order to be able to build out these varieties and then add to the germplasm and as well increase farming. And so critically, Mr. President, so even as we identify the challenges in the context of our plant stock, and again, the need to make sure that we have a comprehensive legislative framework in order to protect it, the government is also making moves to ensure that we innovatively, as much as possible, seek to mitigate those impacts as well. But again, this is also not a new effort. Again, because some would criticize the government in the context of legislation. We're bringing that legislation now to address problems that have been ongoing. But there are different ways that governments can seek to address problems. And so even in the context of that we're having now this comprehensive piece of legislation which has arisen because of, again, wide stakeholder consultation and involvement to make sure that this is as strong a piece of legislation as possible as it seeks to build upon the 2007 Plant Protection Act. What we have been doing, or what the ministry has been doing as well, is bringing along the farmers and seeking to educate them about what is happening in relation to the plant stock, where the threats are, what are the things that we need to be able to preserve. And so up to 2018, the ministry actually held a workshop. And when I say a workshop, not just a talk shop, but really and truly it was called a field exercise in order to be able to, again, expose the farmers to particular plants as well that were under threat. And Mr. President, attendees were treated to presentations on 10 local medicinal plants: Circe, gully root, Christmas bush, cure for all, mosquito bush, wonder for the world, aloe, vervain, seed under the leaf, and periwinkle. Now, don't ask me, Mr. President, about all of those. There were some that I don't know, some that I recognize, some that I don't know. I don't know the Christmas bush. I'm assuming the mosquito bush is perhaps what is used for mosquitoes? Citronella, and probably let's call it the mosquito bush. And there's some we're unfamiliar with, but that is, again, Mr. President, the whole point. Yeah, that we have plant material here on the island that, again, can be critical to maintaining our food security. But if we don't protect it, if we don't preserve it, if we don't make sure that we have a framework that provides the necessary control measures, Mr. President, then all of these things that are natural to Barbados, we can lose. And so the effort is to make sure that we are able to preserve, Mr. President, the point that I'm making, that we're doing so in multiple ways. So yes, the legislative framework, but using as well innovative ways and grounding it within the context of Barbadians, within the context of farmers themselves, to help them to understand how it is that we need to go about protecting and ensuring that we can maintain as much as possible a healthy plant stock. One of the things as well, Mr. President, was done at that field exercise was that they were also briefed on the use of what is called botanic pesticides, Mr. President. And botanic pesticides can be derived from the same plants that you're seeking to protect. So it's about using the entire plant stock to now make a natural pesticide that then can be used then to control pests as well. Again, so not only in the context of, again, seeking to educate, this is what is going to happen, this is the potential threat, but also as well, how can we effectively address the issue, again, using local materials, Mr. President. So that in the context, again, of the legislation, what we have, Mr. President, is a legislation that allows for a number of different interventions. So one, in the context, yes, of import and export, allowing people to be able to register, but as well, you would note that within the legislation that we also make provision for a advisory. We also make provision for an advisory working group that is made up of a number of critical stakeholders. And this, again, is part of government's attempt to be able to ensure that we create an inclusive frame. Now, in the previous legislation, we did have such a grouping, but what we have done in the context of this legislation is looked at an advisory working group and ensure that that advisory working group is made up, again, of all the critical agencies that are going to be involved. And Mr. President, I do want to call them because it's important then to be able to see that we are working across ministries, and this is not just something that we are attacking in the context of the Ministry of Agriculture, but that the government is fully aware that if we are to do this in a comprehensive way, then that we need to have that intersectoral linkage. So you would see, Mr. President, in the context of that advisory working group, that we have as well representative, of course, from the Ministry of Agriculture, but also the ministry responsible for the environment, for health, for trade, for legal affairs, the Customs Department, the Police Service, the University of the West Indies, the Barbados Chamber of Commerce, the Barbados National Standards Institution, and a farmers' organization, and one person representing the interest of importers, and one person representing the interest of exporters as well, Mr. President. So a comprehensive group that includes all of the critical stakeholders that will be advising, it's an advisory working group on key areas in the context of advising on phytosanitary policy, making recommendations for the enactment of legislation. Again, because we know that this process is ongoing, standards may change, and we want to be able to ensure that we are on the cutting edge, given the consequences for the island. So that this working group will also contribute to what are the other parts, areas of legislation that might be needed in order to shore up and continue to have to protect Mr. President, and a number of different areas that this working group will be able to advise the authority that will be established, the organization that will be established in the context of this legislation. Mr. President, one of the critical areas that we must look at when we talk about plant protection, of course, and as I said before, as I quoted the statistics, is pest management. It is pest management. So that it establish a national plant protection organization that will have the authority, Mr. President, in order to be able to ensure, again, that we can effectively manage all of the control measures that need to be put in place to be able to protect our plant stock. But in the context of pest management, Mr. President, there's also a threat. Because very often, how do we attempt to manage pests? What do we use? Pesticides. So then we have this circle that we have to be careful to be able to address and be able to monitor. So that if we are not careful in order to have the necessary measures to control the pest, to control the entry, then we will then have further use of pesticides. So that the comprehensive legislation is seeking, and I know, Mr. President, we will not be able to get rid of insects, but what we are doing is seeking as much as possible to make sure that we have the framework for that mitigation. And I want, Mr. President, to note that the current statistics, there was actually a study that was done in 2018 for the Caribbean, which notes that we import over 10,000 tons of pesticide, 10,000 tons of pesticide we import for agricultural use alone. And these include highly hazardous pesticides, which can pose a significant risk to human health and as well biodiversity. And actually, in the context of that study, and they surveyed smallholder vegetable farmers in Trinidad and Jamaica, and it revealed that 59% and 14% of the farmers, respectively, 59% will be for Trinidad, 14% for Jamaica, reported signs and symptoms consistent with the acute or severe pesticide poisoning during the previous 12 months. And many farmers also reported suffering multiple incidents over the years. So, Mr. President, again, so that we have to be able to ensure that we can guard against that use, that heavy pesticide use, by establishing the necessary control measures that this legislation is attempting to allow us to be able to do. And while, Mr. President, we don't necessarily have any invasive pests in Barbados at this moment, it is important that we understand the threat and that we understand, Mr. President, how we can carefully address that through the use not of hazardous pesticides, but again, as I indicated, through the works and efforts of the Ministry of Agriculture to get farmers and households to use natural pesticides that are not as harmful. And that is also going to be extremely significant. Mr. President, I recall several times I've seen in the news about the fact that Barbados wins several awards at the Chelsea Flower Show. Again, not a flower person. I am perhaps not the one you want around, your plants, etc., and forget to water and all of those things, but I admire them and I understand the utility of them, but I'm also understand my limitations as well, Mr. President. And actually, Barbados has a remarkable record of winning a total of 20 medals, 12 silver gilt, and 1 silver in 33 appearances at the Chelsea Flower Show. And we all, as Barbadians, think that is wonderful. That provides opportunities for tourism, provide opportunities for exports, and all of those things. But the Barbados Horticultural Society will tell you that before they get there, to be able to attend that show in Chelsea, they have to be able to go around the island, pick the flowers, and then carefully clean them, Mr. President. Carefully clean them to make sure, again, that they adhere to those international standards for export, and then receive an export certification through the Plant Quarantine Department, which is part of the Plant Protection Department, that certifies that these flowers are, again, safe. And I'm saying that, I'm using that example, Mr. President, again, to demonstrate the importance of us being able to make sure that we have a framework to protect our plant stock, and then to be able as well to trade, Mr. President, and to be able to export. There is tremendous potential in the context of the export market for flowers through the tissue culture lab in St. Philip. There is an attempt, Mr. President, to make sure, again, in the context of flowering plants, that we are able to maintain some of the genetics for flowering plants that we have here and that have the potential as well for export. So that adhering to these standards then also as well has an economic value in terms of us then being able to open specific niche markets for these kinds of flowering plants as well, Mr. President. Mr. President, I want to come back to looking at some specific areas within the bill that build up the framework for ensuring that we have the adequate control measures in place. And in particular, I want to note, Mr. President, because it was raised previously, there's similar language in this plant protection bill as there was in the animal health and veterinary public health bill in relation to the whole issue of self-audits. So at clause 16, there is mention to self-audits as being a methodology by which the organization will be able to ensure that it is applying and meeting all of the necessary standards, Mr. President. Because importantly, we have to ensure that we not only look at the World Trade Organization agreements and make sure that we meet those standards as well, but also the International Plant Protection Convention, to which we are a signatory, Mr. President. But I want to note, as I said before, that in the context of the self-audits, they are an acceptable means for an organization such as the one under this bill to be able to audit itself and ensure that it's meeting the requisite international standards. Mr. President, in the context of the medical fraternity, in the context of the life science, in the context of the construction fraternity, there is evidence, there are studies that indicate that self-inspections or internal audits are an essential part of quality control mechanisms, and that they help to determine whether you are able to meet the guidelines and standards, and that they have tremendous benefits for organizations in several ways. I also actually, Mr. President, want to indicate that in the context specifically now of the bill that we are addressing, that actually the International Plant Protection Convention itself establishes a process for self-audits. It actually indicates that the tool that they have identified for self-audits, that is a useful tool for use by contracting parties to gauge progress of the development of the phytosanitary system over time, or as a tool to be used by facilitators. So it can be used internally or by facilitators. And it specifically indicates that it is meant to be implemented at the pace identified by the country, and there is no urgency to complete the tool when it is used for the purpose of self-assessment. So just, Mr. President, making sure, again, that we reiterate that in the context of the authority and how it will function and how it will report and how it would ensure that it keeps track of the fact that it is meeting the necessary standards, that the self-assessment protocol is one that can be legitimately used. Mr. President, as I close, I want to indicate that, again, globally, the global statistics suggest that food demand is going to increase. And as food demand increase, global food production will also need to increase by 50% from 2012 baseline. And that a large portion of that global food production increase will have to come from land that is already under cultivation. And what that means, Mr. President, again, is a heavy emphasis, again, on preservation, on being able to ensure that we maintain our plant stock that we have now currently, Mr. President, in order for us then to be able to scale. But we can't do that unless we're able to effectively mitigate the threats against it from pests particularly as well, and other plant diseases. And in the context of this legislation and the work that is already being done by the Plant Protection Unit in the context of the Ministry of Agriculture. And I want to take this opportunity, Mr. President, to acknowledge the work of the officers of the Plant Protection Unit. Very often, again, we take such work for granted. We take it for granted there are men and women who turn up every single day and as their job to help protect all of us to help protect, in this case, our plant stock, which means that they help protect our food, Mr. President. And certainly in the context of my work, my early work with the Ministry of Agriculture, I can say to you that the men and women, particularly in the context of the Plant Protection Unit, are not only skilled, but they are passionate about their job and the need for us to be able to ensure that we protect and do what is necessary in the context of our plant stock, Mr. President. I also want to indicate, Mr. President, that one of the very critical ways, again, that we have to look at this issue of plant protection is not only in the context, again, of this legislative framework. This is one part. And I hope, again, Mr. President, that we are able to appreciate that it's a multi-pronged approach. The legislation helps us at a particular level, but then it then has to be grounded in terms of the way that we actually do our work, and I've provided some examples of that. But I just want to also indicate that one of the other ways that the government is seeking to address this issue of how we protect our plant stock is by inculcating this notion of producing more with less, and as well encouraging more efficient ways, Mr. President, of planting, whether that is through vertical planting and freight and all of those areas and all of those measures, so again that we can encourage our farmers in the context of the land that we have available, again, as it says, to produce more with less. Mr. President, with those words, I am obliged and I beg that this bill be now read a second time.
Thank you, Senator Dr. Monroe Knight. Senator Dr. Bradford.
Good morning, Mr. President, and good morning, fellow senators. I rise to support this bill that has been brought to this honorable chamber as clearly part of a suite of actions that the government is taking to modernize the agricultural sector. There can be no doubt, Mr. President, that the plant genetic resources of any country is a fundamental resource, necessary and key for the development of the country. We have lived over the years and noted that in many countries, the devastation of the agricultural sector has resulted in famine, poverty, and serious dislocation of economic and social life around the world. There are many historic examples, one of the most classic being that of the potato famine in Ireland in the 1800s that resulted in millions migrating from Ireland to other places around the world. The devastation of bananas, the devastation of tea and coffee, devastation of many crops around the world that have devastated economies and resulted in human suffering. The bill that is being presented today is part, in my view, of an effort by the government to modernize the agricultural sector. You cannot have a modern agricultural sector unless you have the infrastructure, the professionals, the finance, the technical expertise, and the legislative framework that makes it possible. And to the extent that this bill provides the legislative framework for a modern plant protection system, it represents, in my view, an important advance in modernizing agriculture in our country. Mr. President, we tend not to recognize the agricultural sector for what it is. And we do not recognize it for what it is because, to a large extent, the colonial legacy that we have inherited is a colonial legacy that allowed other people to feed us. We have not depended on farmers in Barbados to provide the food for this nation in the way that many other countries have, depending on their farmers. We depend to a large extent, Mr. President, on farmers from over and away to feed us, and therefore we do not give the importance to agriculture that it should be given. In most countries, the agricultural sector is the sector that feeds the people, and without food, there's no country. And so we need to recognize that the efforts that are being made are critical to our future, especially given the reality of today, where we face the global threats of COVID and pandemics, the global threats of a war, and the global threat of climate change. These three, more than anything else, represents a suite of actions, a suite of initiatives, a suite of challenges that we should be taken on board to understand that we live in a global world and we're impacted by global events that affect our survival. Our commitment to the International Plant Protection Convention and other international bodies and international regulations are critical for us to trade, for us to participate effectively in the global economy, for us to make our mark and get our products into international markets. We must have appropriate global standards. And infrastructure such as that we're discussing today, legislative infrastructure, is critical for us going forward. In a real sense, we are also constructing the platform for the future. This is not a platform for today. This is a platform for building an agricultural sector that can stand the test of time by putting in place those structures that are critical for us going forward. Three things, therefore, that are fundamental. Well-trained professionals. Very often we speak about professionals in law. We speak about professionals in medicine. We speak about professionals in construction. And sometimes we forget that agriculture is a profession that requires skilled, highly trained, technical expertise that is critical for the success of the sector. You cannot have an agricultural sector without having highly trained professionals. I noticed something recently that is critical and we must look at it. Between 2015 and 2020, the University of the West Indies produced one agricultural graduate per year for Barbados. One graduate per year in agriculture. If we had produced one graduate in law, everybody would be wondering what happened. If we had produced one graduate in medicine, everybody would be concerned. But the university produced one graduate in agriculture during a 5-year period, and nobody seemed worried. And we look around for people to put into these particular areas of expertise that are fundamental for the country, and we don't have them because they have not been trained. Some time ago, I had the opportunity to work with a group looking at the new project that is being developed at Jukes and the initiatives that are being developed at Hope. And I made the case that Barbados needs a school for agriculture. We have some initiatives at the community college. We have some initiatives at Samuel Jackman Prescott, but we do not have a school for agriculture. There's Jamaica School of Agriculture. There's the Guyana School of Agriculture. Trinidad has ECIAF, the Eastern Caribbean Institute to train this middle-level professionals in the agricultural sector. In Barbados, there's nothing like that. And we said, we produce one graduate per year in agriculture to support an agricultural sector that we say is important. I would like to ask that as we roll out this suite of new initiatives Last time we dealt with the veterinary initiative, we're dealing with plant protection today. It is my understanding that we're going to be dealing with food safety. As we roll out these initiatives, it is critically important that we make sure that these are not just legal initiatives, but that the financial resources are available to support them. We must ensure that the Ministry of Agriculture is properly financed to deliver on the legislative frameworks that we develop in this chamber. If not, Mr. President, we'll just be developing legal frameworks without appropriate possibility for action and implementation. So we must ensure that as we address these issues, that we also ensure that they can be implemented and that we can get the appropriate financial resources to make it possible for Barbados to have a modern agricultural sector that can contribute to the food security of this nation. I know we cannot produce everything. We cannot produce the wheat. We cannot produce the soybean. We probably cannot produce the rice that we need. But as I will ask the question later, why are we importing pumpkins? Why are we importing lettuce? Why are we importing broccoli? Why are we importing the things that we can produce? It's okay to import the things you cannot produce. Well, what about the things that you can produce? And there's idle land, idle flat land in our country, Mr. President. And we continue to import the things that we can produce. One day, we will wake up and recognize that food security is the fundamental plank for our survival, because we may not be able to get food in the international marketplace. And if you get it, it may be so expensive that you may not be able to afford it. And so, Mr. President, I believe that the legislation that's been brought to the chamber is important. I support it wholeheartedly. I think that we are on the right track in terms of modernizing the legislative framework for agriculture. I would like to just caution us by something I raised with respect to the veterinary authority, the whole idea of self-audits. I still am not comfortable with the idea of institutions being set up and given the right to audit themselves. I believe that we have an Auditor General as part of our Constitution, and the Auditor General has a responsibility to examine the accounts of public agencies and ensure that public funds are managed in an appropriate and transparent way. And therefore, the concept of self-audit, I think, probably removes, in my view, the right of the Auditor General to do his work. And therefore, this is something that probably needs examination. And we must ensure that we do not go into a culture of self-audit. Otherwise, every institution will say, well, I audited my books and they are okay. To me, Mr. President, that is not a good way to go. In summary, Mr. President, I support this legislation. It is a very important piece of work that is being done. I hope that the new arrangement with respect to food safety will also come to the chamber and be debated and made available to us so that we can see what provisions are being presented, and that with the establishment of the veterinary authority and this legislation setting up the plant protection organization, we will move forward to create a modern agricultural sector that can support food security in Barbados. Thank
On
you.
a point of order, Mr. President.
Yes, then.
Thanks. I rise just as the Honourable Senator is about to take his seat. I would just wish to correct for the purpose of the record, as I do not think that the Honourable Senator was intentionally misleading the chamber. The inference by the senator during the course of his remarks was, and I think the specific his specific observation was that the Auditor General's oversight, as I understand it, had been removed. But this is not a body corporate. This is a department within the Ministry of Agriculture, and the Ministry of Agriculture is audited by the Auditor General. So there has been no removal of oversight, and specifically making this point of order so that nobody in the chamber and no one listening outside of the chamber will be misled or confused by the legislation and the provisions in it.
Thank you, Senator Thompson. Other speakers? Senator Paris.
Mr. President, I rise to make a brief submission on this bill before the Honourable Chamber this morning. And Part 7 of the bill speaks to the offences and the penalties. A person who fails to comply with any order or direction lawfully made or given under this Act, or imports any plant, product, or other regulated article at a place other than a designated port of entry. And Mr. President, I start there because if these persons are found guilty, they are liable to a conviction of $50,000 or 1 year in prison, or both. I do believe that with the offenses, that an educational program needs to be done, which would educate persons as to the importance of adhering to the guidelines as stipulated in this bill. Persons traveling to a country might enjoy some mangoes, they might like some plants, and they want to bring them back to Barbados. They are not aware of the damage they are doing when these things are tucked away somewhere in a bag, or, they have them concealed. And when they get to Barbados and these things are confiscated, the customs officer and the plant protection officer are the enemies to these persons. Why? Because they're being deprived of that mango which they enjoyed while they were overseas, and they were looking forward to planting these plants to beautify their surroundings. I am saying that if persons are educated about these things, then they would understand the damage that they are doing by concealing them. And I further want to say that as part of this educational program, we need to ensure that at the ports of entry, both the seaport and airports, and in strategic locations, persons can see displayed the don'ts and do's about importing plants, because some of them are not aware of what happens, and when they're leaving, their attention should be brought to, you cannot bring a mango, you cannot bring this, and the reason. It would also help the country and save us from being exposed to these plant pests and other stuff, and this will save us thousands of dollars. And I'm sure that the educational programs should say to the persons who are traveling why they should not bring them, the penalty for doing such, and the effect it would have on the country. It would also save the farmers destruction of their plants, because we will bring them in. Your neighbor might be planting something, and it is affected by the plant that you confiscated, and the pest would affect him and he would lose his crops. I see the bill also brings attention to the awareness of owners who suspect the presence of quarantine pests on their premises, and they are asked to bring the matter to the organization. We sometimes see our plants looking different or have a fungus, and we try to treat it in our own way. We put Epsom salts, we do all types of things. But again, Mr. President, this is where the small farmer, with the educational program, this will help to save him thousands of dollars. And when we inform the organization of what is happening to the plant, the plant inspection officer can inspect the premises and take samples in order to detect the problem. Mr. President, with this educational program, I am sure that the country can be saved thousands of dollars, and an awareness is brought to the general public as to why they cannot confiscate plants and what the damage is done when they do so. So with that brief introduction, I make an appeal to the Ministry of Agriculture to embark on this educational program so that persons can benefit. Mr. President, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you, Senator Paris. Any other speakers?
Thank you.
Senator Herod.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Good morning to...
Turn on your mic, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and good morning again to one and all of my fellow senators. I want to, sir, begin to complete a sentence made by Senator Brathwaite, where he, in agreement, and I agree with it, he said, without food, there is no country. But in further alignment to what we are discussing today, I dare continue to say, without good food, there may be a country with stagnated development. Mr. President, it has been said by colleagues from this side already that an increase in terms of the population growth, not only in Barbados, but the world, is very closely aligned to an increase in terms of globalization, by extension, an increase in international trade. And international trade, to meet the consumption of 7.8 billion people across this world, poses significant concerns in terms of facilitating movement of services, movement of goods, which includes agricultural produce as well, and food all across this world. It is a problem that goes beyond just Barbados or the Caribbean or any country. It is a consistent problem. Entering this debate today, sir, we have faced a situation in the recent past at the 33rd intersessional meeting of the Conference of Heads of Government back in May 2022, where our leaders agreed to reduce the food import bill by 25% by the year 2025. We enter this debate today, sir, at a time where the world continues to face the ravages of climate change. Suffice it to say, last year alone, 28 countries recorded their hottest temperatures on their official registers. One that comes to mind, definitely, is United Kingdom, where they recorded 40 degrees Celsius for the first time in their history. And it brought immediate thoughts in my head of perhaps landing at London Heathrow one of these days and seeing the runway laden with banana trees or Bajan cherry trees. 40 degrees Celsius in the UK. Mr. President, we enter this debate today at a time where we followed a previous debate where collectively, as a chamber, we agreed to the importance of biodiversity to Barbados via the adoption, of course, of the biodiversity strategy that was presented. Now, these issues, as I said, are not limited to Barbados alone. And as per usual, if it may be my approach, I tend to fly out to Barbados before I come to the meat of the matter in discussion. And I will fly as far east as I can, perhaps even in Kenya. And in Kenya, they face the same issues that we face in terms of the threat of the reduction of biodiversity. They face the same threats that we face in terms of food security, flooding from time to time as well in the Horn of Africa. They face many of the same things we face. But interestingly enough, they proposed a plant protection bill as well 2 years ago. And in this particular bill, they would have recommended the establishment of KEPHIS, K-E-P-H-I-S, which is the Kenyan Plant Health Inspectorate Service. And they are the official focal point for the International Plant Protection Convention, and also liaise very closely with the World Trade Organization in terms of the protocols to ensure the safe trade between Kenya and other countries as well. Interestingly enough, KEPHIS also administers something called the Kenyan Plant Health Protection Fund, which is tasked with emergency protocols to ensure that if there is a significant risk identified, or if there's a prospects of a significant risk in terms of pests coming into the country, that they're automatically activated to ensure maximum protection and mitigating any further risk to the country of Kenya. And before I leave Africa, I wanted to mention as well the seriousness of this particular bill as it relates not only to the Caribbean but Africa. Last week when we were here debating the Animal Protection Bill, which is now the Animal Protection Act, the leaders of Africa were in Senegal, sir. They were in Senegal 25th of January to be exact, discussing bolstering food security within that region against the backdrop of recognizing that both the quantity and quality of food entering Africa is increasingly of a questionable character, particularly those coming from other countries. Sir, at that meeting, the major milestone, was the establishment of a $30 billion fund representing 1% of Africa's GDP. And those funds, none of them came from the government of Africa. 20 billion came from the African Development Bank, and a further 10 billion came from other donor agencies that attended the fund and decided that they're going to provide grant funding to bolster production in Africa. And while Africa and the Caribbean are quite different because we understand that Africa represents about 65% of unused arable land across the world, at the same time recognizing that Africa represents a third of the 828 million people on this planet that are at risk of serious ailments related to food security. But I just want to underscore the seriousness at which other regions outside of Barbados basically are facing the same situations and implementing the same protocols that we're looking to establish by this bill today. As per usual, sir, I'll fly closer back to home. And Senator Bradford made mention of it in terms of similar initiatives across the region, Guyana. He didn't call the name, but I think specifically he was referring to, sir, NARI, the National Agricultural Research and Extension Institute in Guyana, which is not just focused on producing plants, and it was the brainchild of Forrest Burnham, by the way, not producing plants, but creating an agricultural school. I had the privilege of visiting NARI about 2 years ago, and seeing at that particular institute they had some residences set up to ensure that those students that come to study agriculture can stay on the compound and basically conduct their business without having to worry about commuting to get to the classes as well. And I bought some cherry trees from down there as well to donate to the school in Guyana. I must mention that. A very interesting and lovely place to visit. But sir, Barbados does not stand alone in terms of this particular issue, and I can specifically go to the bill before us today. I recognize, based on the comments and the contributions by Senator Monroe Knight, the need for there to be an advisory board. And there is no question with respect to the importance of that particular body within the National Plant Protection Organization to ensure that proper guidance is given from a multi-sectoral perspective in terms of how we are going to go about establishing the protocols with respect to this bill. But sir, I also want to say that this bill really and truthfully is about one word, and I don't fancy calling big words, and this is a big word to me because I don't call them too often, but this bill is really about reciprocity. and that perhaps the longest one I call for the week. Basically, a give and take. Reciprocity is about ensuring that while we in Barbados seek to safeguard ourselves for the imports coming into our country, we at the same time establish the same safeguards for the exports that go out of our country as well. It is about, sir, ensuring that every person that enters this island and lives in this island, not just Barbadians, not just residents, but even if you visit Barbados for 6 years, 6 months, 6 days, or 6 hours, and you're exposed to anything any plants or anything plant-based, that you're exposed to those entities of high quality, of low risk to you and yours. And sir, against the backdrop of that reciprocity, it means that we also have, by way of this bill, a duty of care. A duty of care to those persons in Barbados, visiting Barbados, or exposed to any of the agricultural produce or plant-based produce in Barbados. Any failure, sir, to not move ahead with this particular protocol, really and truthfully, is an act of negligence in my perspective. We have a duty of care, sir, to ensure that these provisions are made. Sir, I also want to make mention of CARICOM. And this is perhaps my last point. While it is that the International Plant Protection Convention and the World Trade Organization focuses on the harmonization of protocols across the world with respect to phytosanitary conditions and other protocols that ensure the safe entry and exit of plants and plant-based materials from the countries, CARICOM has a duty, sir, to focus on the harmonization of the agricultural strategy within the region. And for the record, sir, I am not yet convinced that that particular strategy is one that meets with the particular demands that we face as a collective region. I am not satisfied, sir. I understand and appreciate the 25 by 25 policy, but let me tell you a tale about another entity, another collective entity, different countries. There's an entity across the world called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, focused, sir, on bolstering security amongst members. And they had the same discussion in terms of a collective cause that they want to ensure that no member is infringed upon by any external entity for security purposes. But apart from the talk, sir, they had a common strategy which guided a number of different sub-strategies as well. The common strategy is that every single country submitted 2% of their GDP towards security. And we would have heard past presidents of the United States complain and comment about it, but they had a common strategy, sir. As it relates to agriculture, it would be interesting to look at another entity not too far from NATO called the European Union, and they have a common agricultural policy to which 33.1% of that EU budget goes towards agriculture. 33.1%. Now, sir, I don't want to mix NATO, the intentions of NATO and the intentions of this bill together, but I am tempted to say, which I will, that what we're facing in terms of our agricultural sector can be viewed as a war. When we consider the situation of constant and increasing subsidies from other countries, which then force, by whatever means they have, smaller countries, developing countries, to draw back on subsidies and focus on internal production without the capacity and the technology to do so, sir. We are fighting a war, sir. So I want to say that, in conclusion, sir, I support this bill 100%, but insofar as it goes to the regional connection across this area and CARICOM, that we need to bolster a more harmonized approach to our common agricultural policy and move beyond just the broad policies and look at particular strategies that can move this country forward, sir. And I support this bill in its entirety. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Herron. Any other speakers? Senator Dr. Hines.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. President. I've been really enjoying this debate so far. I found it very instructive, and I've learned a lot, both from listening to the contributions today, as well as reading this legislation and the previous legislation that we dealt with relating to animals. It really has been an eye-opener, and I have to express my appreciation that we have this type of legislation coming to Barbados. This aside, there are some observations I would like to point out. So just for my own purposes, to get me where I want to go, this legislation provides for the establishment of a national plant protection organization with a chief plant health officer and inspectors. As we have heard, it also provides for an advisory working group to advise the minister and the organization. Useful. This legislation will support the need to deal with the introduction of pests and other diseases into the country. Like Senator Paris, I had some concerns about persons not understanding this legislation and continuing to do things that we often do. People travel and they bring back a cutting, or they bring back a fruit because it is nice, and then they plan to plant the seeds. But even though I didn't know the existing legislation, I think there is still some awareness that you're not really supposed to do this. You're supposed to, when you fill in your customs declaration forms, they ask you certain questions, so people kind of know. So that's where they put no. They don't have any plant, anything. Even when they know they have a cutting, or they have whatever it is they have. So I'm glad that the point about education has been raised, not just because it is an offense, but because this is an offense that will attract a significant fine if enforced. So I'm glad that that was raised in here. It's also, this legislation is also important because it addresses, as Senator Brathwaite and others have said, food security. It addresses agriculture. It addresses biological diversity, all things that are critical for this country and truly for the world. And you see some connections across the types of legislation and resolutions and so on that we've been discussing since I have been here that I think make a lot of sense and show a level of planning that is commendable. This also fits well with a resolution I hope we will get to at some point that Senator Brathwaite has brought as a piece of private member's business, but hopefully we'll get there. It fits very well with the documents he submitted. It also fits well, as others have noted, with the legislation on animal health and veterinary public health, which also saw the establishment of a veterinary authority as the competent authority for regulation in that area. So we see the creation of these institutions that are to function as regulatory authorities. And this can be worthwhile. These types of institutions can be worthwhile. But I have a few questions here. One question I have relates to the fact that we are repealing existing legislation that covers some of these things already. So we talk about the establishment of a national plant protection organization. However, in the 2007 Plant Protection Act, such was already established. The main difference I see is that one has a Z, this one, and the other one has an S. The organization is spelled differently. My question is, if it was already possible to establish a national plant protection organization, why haven't we done this already? I can understand the need to put all of this under an overarching piece of legislation, which is what we are looking at here. Perhaps it is far more comprehensive. But what has stopped us from already establishing this national plant protection organization, whether with a Z or an S? Why haven't we already established it, knowing that it is so important? We could still have crafted this legislation that brings everything under one roof. But why not already start with the organization? I also see, and as Senator Monroe Knight noted, that an advisory council was established under that 2007 legislation. And my question is quite similar to the advisory working group under this legislation. Why isn't this functioning? And this takes me to the bigger question. I don't have any issue with this legislation. I think it is really important. And as I said, I've learned a lot. I'm glad to see that Barbados is a serious place in the 21st century that is taking serious issues seriously. We are a world that is very interconnected, and for us to believe that pests and diseases that exist in other places cannot get here is foolishness. We would really be living in a dream world if we did not understand the seriousness of this and the potential consequences for agriculture. I'm not sure if I heard anybody talk about horticulture. I think Senator Monroe Knight spoke about Chelsea Flower Show. And not just that the Chelsea Flower Show, we are able to win these awards, but we can also think about this as industry for investment as well, that perhaps we could be exporting cut flowers and so on. So this is really important. But I have a concern about what we do when we establish institutions. And Senator Brathwaite noted this already. There is an institution that we already have, is a department. And I just want to get the name because these things are not necessarily my area of expertise. But I tried to do a little background. We have a plant protection department already that I believe is supposed to be doing much of what this plant protection organization seeks to do. So I would just like a little clarity on what the difference is between these. What is the difference between this organization that is going to be established, that could have been established since 2007 or any time between 2007 and now, and the plant protection department that has an entomology unit, a plant pathology unit, and a plant quarantine unit? Is there a significant difference? My next concern relating to these institutions is similar to that of Senator Brathwaite, and it has to do with the creation of institutions that end up frustrating the persons that work in the institutions. Why are they frustrated? Because yes, I believe they are committed to the task that they are supposed to perform. They are dedicated to these security areas, but they do not necessarily have the resources that they require to do their jobs appropriately. And this is not only financial resources, it's not just skills, it may be the number of persons dedicated to these entities. Okay, we can look at ports of entry. That is one thing. But how many people are going to be employed so that this organization that is to be established does what it is intended to do, that it fulfills its mandate appropriately? This is not a criticism. This is a significant concern because I believe we have several institutions in this country that the intention of these institutions is noble, or the intentions are noble of these institutions. They're supposed to do things that will carry the country forward. But the institutions are unable to function appropriately, Mr. President, because they're not adequately resourced. So we want to live up to international standards, but then we do not provide the ability to ensure that we do this. We want to protect against pests, and then we do not provide the relevant personnel and resources to ensure that we can do this appropriately. So we may end up virtue signaling to the international community as well as to the people of Barbados. Oh, look, we have created these organizations and these entities that are going to deal with particular matters. But in truth, they struggle to do this. And it is not because the legislation is poor. It is not because the intention is a poor intention, but it is because we have not appropriately thought through what it really requires to do, what is really required to do this properly. I hope that we are not building institutions that will frustrate the personnel, that will not be able to do what they are supposed to do, because these are really critical things. We hear about implementation deficit across CARICOM, not just in Barbados. And again, I think it is because we do not always have the capabilities to implement the things we set about to do. there is an assumption that if you create an organization, this is some kind of magic that is going to solve the problem or address the problem. But an institution, an organization on its own is not a magical solution. It is not going to address the issue. So, Mr. President, I really plead with the government to ensure that because these issues are so important, that this entity and other similar entities that are created in different areas have the resources they require to do what it is they're supposed to do. We know of so many issues in this country. We can think of, if we're framing this in an environmental context, people dump illegally. You see signs all over the place telling you the fine for dumping, and right around the sign, bare rubbish. We see members of parliament in our newspapers and on the media complaining about illegal dumping. We cannot police this appropriately. We see persons who are up and down the coastline complaining about things happening on the coastline that perhaps should not be happening. And we have entities that are supposed to deal with this. And it is not that the people are not motivated. It's not that they do not have the best interests of Barbados in mind, but they do not have the ability to do what they are supposed to do. So, in closing, Mr. President, I plead that these entities be facilitated in their work with the skills, the personnel, the financial resources that they require in order to do their work appropriately. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Hines. Any of the speakers? Senator Linder.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, I'm sorry for being late, but Mr. President, I was reading some nights ago and I fell asleep, and I looked at the message. When I woke up, I looked at the messages on my phone, and I saw that we were going to debate a plant protection bill. And I said to myself, I will not have to prepare for that, because I can talk about the QEH, the QEH plant. But sadly, I realized that it wasn't about the QEH. It was about plants. Mr. President, this country has a long history. I listened to the debate as I was coming here, and I think Senator Monroe was introducing the bill. But this country has had a long history of involvement in plant development. And our staple crop, sugarcane, has had a long history of tremendous advances, both, I think, in terms of planters doing their own things, but also in terms as an organized effort with the cane breeding station. And we continue to do great things with it. But that time seems to be coming to an end, because the world has declared sugar to be an enemy. But, Mr. President, I notice that in the definitions in this document, there is no mention of a definition for genetically modified plants. I'm talking about agricultural plants. And I wonder if it was intentional or not, because GMO is a big word, Mr. President. And what may look like one thing is not what you think it is. So you can plant corn that looks the same as the other corn, and you can spray a pesticide on it, and it will not kill it. It will only kill the weeds. And you have to ask, if you planted a plant in a small island that was resistant to a pesticide, to a herbicide, and it escaped your control, what would happen? And I really think that within this document, there has to be some consideration for what will and what can happen when we have the influx of serious numbers of genetically modified plants. Senator Brathwaite, I'm sure, will give us a long dissertation on that matter. And I'm sure at some point in time he will. Now, Mr. President, you can't speak of plant protection without speaking of protection of insects and bees. And I know that the Minister of Agriculture has been speaking of bees in terms of honey production. And that's just a byproduct. That's just, the bees don't really care that we are interested in their honey, which we steal from them. I think, as a person who happens to have a few plants, I'm more interested in the quiet work the bees do. And if you're going to speak about plant protection and agriculture, we have to, on this rock, seriously contemplate whether we need to do anything to protect the insects that do the important work of pollination. And the indiscriminate spraying of pesticides on plants to kill insects has effects and have had negative effects on the bee population. Not so long ago, when I was a boy, Mr. President, there were lots of beehives, not just wasp, but honey beehives all over the place. And you're hard pressed to identify where you can find a beehive nowadays. You're more likely to be able to say, that man keeps bees, because you can see all the hives that he has, the commercial hives. But the naturally occurring hives are few and far between. Senator Thompson indicated she has a lot. Well, well, that's a rare event. There are not many around. And they are an insect to be valued, Mr. President. Now, Senator Bradford spoke about the important matter of food security, and I think Senator Herwood also spoke of it. And the Ministry of Agriculture has a list of agricultural tariffs where one gets duty-free concessions on certain things, Mr. President. But the world has moved away in some places, or is rather encouraging, rather than having large expanses of land taken up to grow ground-level crops. We are looking at short turnover crops and vertical farms. And if you're going to be progressive, we have to look to provide some tariffs, some tariff reductions for people to import the devices, the containers, not the definition of a container in this document, sir, but the containers that come with these vertical farms, where you can farm 4 times or 5 times the land space in one small area and have tremendous production without the use of pesticides in the same space. And while Senator Monroe correctly pointed out that this effort has to be between many government departments working together, and you'll only see results in time, it's not going to happen overnight. But we need to also quickly put in place the things that are modern and progressive. So it would mean, sir, that a small farmer doesn't mean that you have to have a 1/4 acre of land. You can have 20,000 square feet and produce enough crops as if you had 5 acres. If you were allowed the concessions or to bring in the modern equipment to run such a farm. And I would like to encourage the government to contemplate it. Because if you're going to speak of producing high quality, healthy foods at low cost so people can afford it, you have to provide the means where the farmers can do it, sir, in a sensible way. And the farmers' inputs, sir, influence significantly what they charge. It is not all profit. The margins are quite narrow. Now, Mr. President, I totally support this bill, and I hope, sir, that when it is passed, that there will be immediate action, and not as some persons are suggesting, that as in the past, the bill is passed, it sits, some effort is made, but it's not truly implemented. Mr. President, some years ago, I met a gentleman called Mr. Barton Clark, and he said to me something that worried me. He suggested that I stop cutting. All right, the ministry pays a tariff if you have fruit trees to keep between the creeks clear. They call it, it's a maintenance tariff. They pay you a small fee per tree per year to keep the areas clean between them. He said, maybe we should stop cutting the bush out from between there for a while. And I thought, well, that'd be crazy. I'll get over a bush. And in the same breath, he added, but it'll affect your yields. The insects will come back, and the butterflies will come back, and the ants will grow on the trees, and you get the pollination. And I decided that I would listen to his wisdom. And I say, sir, that he's right. So I've been questioning whether all the tariffs that we have, whether that's supposed to help agriculture and help with plant protection, whether these tariffs need to be revised in a serious way, not just with a myopic, narrow view that you must keep your orchard clean and look like a lawn between the orchard, but what are you trying to achieve by giving a tariff? For example, sir, there is a tariff that allows tractors, but it doesn't provide for a tracked vehicle. And that means that the farmer who has chosen to plant an orchard on a very steep slope might not be able to operate a wheeled vehicle because it's too steep, but he doesn't get duty-free concessions on a tracked vehicle. So you have to ask that the persons who are responsible for running these institutions really look at what they're trying to achieve and consult with people who really do the work. Mr. President, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Maynard. If there are no speakers, let Senator Dr. Munro next to wrap up.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me echo the sentiments, I believe, of Dr. Christina Hines, that, these discussions that we have had over last week and into this week have been indeed very informative, very in-depth. I believe all of the comments that we've had here contribute to a fleshing out and a fulsome understanding by all of us and hopefully the public as well, and also broader appreciation of the bill and what we are attempting to do. Mr. President, I note again that Senator Dr. Charleston Brathwaite, in his response, as he did again last week, is commending the government for this legislation and indicating that it provides an important advance in terms of the modernization of the agricultural sector. And again, also as well, I think everybody has echoed the sentiment that transformation will take time, that there's not an opportunity for us to do everything, that there are steps and processes and policies that will have to be put in place over time. And in the context of us reviewing quite comprehensively all of the critical pieces of legislation that needs to be able to come to bear in the context of that modernization exercise, that process will also take time. So as we work through the legislative process, we have to then work through the regulatory process and then look at policies and implementation downstream as well. So the process of reviewing what it is that we are doing, reviewing process, Mr. President, is an ongoing effort in the context of transformation. I want, Mr. President, to look at the issue that that Senator Dr. Charleston Brathwaite raised in respect of the need to make sure that we have well-trained professionals who are then able to carry forward this particular agenda. And Mr. President, I completely agree with him. I think there's no argument there. We also heard that echoed in the context of Senator Dr. Christina Hines, when she entreats us to make sure that in the setting up of institutions, that they're adequately staffed, that we have the adequate human resources in order to be able to make sure that the institutions can function as they should. Mr. President, there are gaps. We admit that there are gaps, and in particular in the context of agriculture, we struggle against a society that still is holding on to the notion of agriculture and its association with slavery, with colonialism, and the fact that in the context of a more modern society, we do not want to see our children become part of agriculture. And therefore, the ability to attract young people, the ability to attract professionals in the area is pushing against a cultural, Mr. President, impression of agriculture and what it means, and what it will do, and what it says. And that is something, Mr. President, that we do have to be able to work on. We do have to be able to combat. We do have to be able to work with institutions like the University of the West Indies to make sure that there are more adequate programs. We do have to do the necessary outreach to get people to understand that we're talking about a modern agricultural sector and not the traditional sector, Mr. President. But there are gaps, and those gaps we have to fill over time. But, Mr. President, in the context of attempting to address that cultural issue, we face the situation of, again, we do need to be able to move forward. And there are different ways that we can do that. So even if there are technical gaps here locally, then we need to be able to bring in that expertise, even as we attempt to then build the local capacity. I do want, Mr. President, to also indicate that in the context of the National Development Scholarships 2022, that there were a number of areas that are germane to agriculture, which is, again, government's attempt, again, to encourage people to look at the professional areas of agriculture and to therefore be able to know that they will be supported. So that, for instance, there is on that list agricultural engineering, post-harvest technology, agricultural economics, Mr. President. There's also climate change and sustainable development, which also is tied into agriculture. And then there are a number of other related areas in relation to fisheries as well. So that we recognize that there is a gap, and we have to be able to address that at a particular level in terms of culture. But I think that we need to then to be able to say we cannot stop, Mr. President. We need to be able to move on in terms of modernization of the sector. And as we do that, then find ways in order to build that capacity. And we're doing that in the context of providing incentives and also as well, trying to make sure that we are working with the necessary institutions to encourage it. In the context of the school system, the Ministry of Education has been working with schools across the island to encourage them to once again, because they were vibrant at one time, in order to be able to have agricultural programs. And I think that we would see some of that bearing fruit. Sometimes we do see, reports again of schools, of children being able to plant and be able to utilize within their debts what they have planted and so on. So there are efforts in order to be able to do it and to address it. Those efforts will take some time, Mr. President. Again, it's that transformative journey that we are embarking on. In terms of the issue of the financial resources that are available to deliver on the legislation as well, Mr. President, I also want to indicate we are in a resource-constrained environment. I hope that we can all appreciate that COVID was a real thing. It happened, yeah? And we are in a situation of high inflation, all of the other things. But at the same time, Mr. President, we see this government, and I think as Senator Dr. Christina Hines mentioned, being able to have a suite of resolutions, a suite of legislation, again, all intended to move us on that track of modernization, but at the same time as well, seeking to make sure that we are able to have the resources, not all of the resources, as I indicated in the previous debate on the Animal Health and Veterinary Public Health Bill, coming from within the government coffers. And I think that that is a model that we need to be able to move away from, thinking that the only way that we can meet that resource gap is by government directly having money and being the only investor to address the issue, but also as well looking for the ways in which we can attract private investment and also grant funding. So that in that context, the government, the World Bank approved a $100 million loan for the government of Barbados recently, and there was a lot of discussion about whether or not we should have taken that loan. But one of the critical pillars of that loan is about investment in sustainable climate smart agriculture. Yeah? And so that, Mr. President, we face a dichotomy in terms of the fact we do have these big priorities, but governments have a small pool of resources, so that there are times when we are going to have to, in order to address them, be able to borrow as we have done. But we see that borrowing as a critical investment, as somebody said, not for now, but for later. So that for us, as a government, the investment and the financing that is needed comes from a multiplicity of parts, and that the government is continuing to be able to look for ways, so that already within the government, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Forest Trade, there are committees that are looking and working for ways in which we can go after available grant financing that may be able to help us to reach some of the financial and resource gaps that we have. And where, sorry, Mr. President, and where we need to, we will at times have to, as we did in the context of the World Bank loan, seek to be able to borrow money to fill that gap, but again, stressing, Mr. President, that we are borrowing for transformation. In relation to the question of why are we importing certain foods when there are certain foods that we can plant, Mr. President, that is a real challenge, but I want to indicate again that is also part of the transformative process. So in the context of the government's commitment to the 25 by 25, and what that is a CARICOM commitment to reducing by 25% the import bill by 2025, the government, this is our government of Barbados, has identified a number of agricultural products that we will seek to ensure that we reduce our import bill by boosting local production. And Mr. President, I want to be able to identify those: broccoli, onion, carrot, lettuce, cabbage, sweet pepper, tomato, watermelon, pumpkin, cauliflower, celery, cantaloupe. So those are some of the products that have been identified that we can then seek to have, one, a good competitive advantage in, Mr. President, by producing here locally, and then helping us to reduce our import bill. But again, Mr. President, I say to you again, we know that we want to see everything happening at the same time. But we match that within the context of knowing that we have limited resources, so that things are progressing and maybe not all happening and everybody not seeing them happen right now at the very same time in the context of the kind of society that we want. We want instant results, but that there is a plan for transformation and a plan to address that gap. And the ministry is moving much apace in terms of attempting to meet that deficit in the context of our import bill and our commitment to the 25 by 25 as well. Mr. President, the issue, again, that was raised in terms of audit, I believe that was, in terms of self-audit, that was addressed, but I do want to identify that the International Plant Protection Convention, which is a UN convention that sets the framework for plant protection internationally, itself, thank you, itself identifies self-audits, and itself has an instrument that it says to countries that they can use in the context of self-audits. So that self-audits is a legitimate tool that can be used. It does not at all replace, and if you look at the clause, it does not say that self-audit is the only tool. It says external or self-audit. External or self-audit. So it does not preclude the involvement of the Auditor General or even any other outside agency that may want to be able to come in. But it allows the agency to benefit from having an audit that continually allows it to assess its progress as well. In relation to the indication from Senator Paris on the need for an education, particularly in looking at the issue of the offences as well, Mr. President. I want to identify and completely agree that we do need an education program, but also, as Senator Dr. Christina Hines pointed out, the reason why it's often in that part of the suitcase, in the corner, fold up in the towel, and then with the sheet, and then with something else on top of it or at the bottom of the bag is because we know that it's illegal. It's because we know. We all have to sign a declaration, and the declaration says, indicate if you are bringing in these fruits because of the threat that it plays. But I do agree, as Senator Price has indicated, that we need to have a continual education program because perhaps people don't understand how big the threat is. And that perhaps is what we need to educate people on. But I do want to point out as well, in relation to Clause 50, that the fines apply to a person who grows, sells, offers for sale, transport, or distributes in any manner any plant product, or other regulated article, knowing that it is affected by a quarantine pest as well. And if you look at it, it really applies these penalties to people who knowingly, Mr. President, endanger the plant stock on the island. But agreeing, like I said before, Mr. President, that it is important. Again, fully agreeing with everything that was said by Senator Harewood in relation to the need to have a strong framework and his example of Kenya. I do want to identify that in this legislation at 12.1 that there is provision, Senator Harewood, for a fund such as the one that you have identified in the context of Kenya and that we have there. And I take on board your own personal feelings in relation to the CARICOM strategy, but again, reiterate our commitment as a government to working through on making sure that we meet the commitments in relation to CARICOM. In terms of Senator Dr. Christina Hines' indication of what are the differences she identified in relation, one, to the advisory body that it established versus the council that was established in the 2007 legislation, and also as well, why is it that whether or not the authority that was established again in the 2007 Act, whether or not it actually functioned or not, and why do we need necessarily then perhaps again to recreate in the context of this bill again for that authority. I'll say two things in that context, Mr. President. So yes, we have a plant protection department which is made up of 3 sections. The legislation makes provision for organization, so that it doesn't necessarily mean that we are then going to have a new entity, but no, we will have an entity that will operate as now that national organization or that competent authority, because as Senator Dr. Christina Hines identified, they are doing most of the work. But what we are doing now is mainstreaming and as well providing greater authority for that body that currently exists in the context of this legislation, Mr. President. In the context of whether or not the council actually worked again under the 2007 legislation, Mr. President, we would note that in the context of this bill, we have an expansion in relation to the inclusion now of representatives that have an interest in importing and exporting. So it does expand on the council. However, I do take the larger point that the senator is making in relation to making sure that we are not establishing bodies for the sake of establishing bodies and making sure that they work. And I do want to say, Mr. President, and again, I'm always one that says here, I will have the honest conversation. And again, we've heard this, that there were times when we were not necessarily taking agriculture as seriously as it should. That's a fact, and that's across perhaps successive administrations. But at the same time, what we have now is a government who is saying that it is doubling down on that commitment. It is doubling down on ensuring that it has the framework. We could have left it in the context of amending 2007 as it did, but we've sought to expand it and given it, Mr. President, careful powers in terms of assisting, in terms of building out. And even though the council, as a council, may not have functioned within the context of the Ministry of Agriculture, there have been processes that have brought these very stakeholders together in order to be able to consult. So that in the context of this particular bill, the intent now is to make sure that we are able to activate those mechanisms there. The issue of the implementation or lack thereof, that is also, something that is a subject of resources. But again, I can only indicate this government's commitment to implementation. I indicated and brought examples of various initiatives that the government is already doing in the context of innovating around plant protection. I talked about what Export Barbados was doing. I talked about the education that was already happening. I talked about the examples that were already given to farmers in terms of producing natural pesticides. So that the work, Mr. President, is happening. We do have to struggle against to make sure that we put our head down, to make sure that we have the implementation. But this is the first cog in the process of making sure that we have the appropriate legislative framework then. And if we note as well, in the context of the legislation, it provides for reporting that opens up accountability for all of us to be able to monitor the work of the institutions that have been established. And Mr. President, the final responses in relation to Senator Dr. Christopher Maynard in relation to the mention of why there was no mention of GMO, the issue of bees and biodiversity and the disappearance of bees, and the question of the concessions for farmers. Now, in relation to the issue of genetically modified food and why they're not here, and I take that point, but to indicate as well that that is a particular, a whole subject that we have to be able to handle comprehensively, yeah? The issue of GMO and its impact on the agricultural sector, is fundamental. And it is one that we have to be able to do some research on because there's both benefits and as well some of the negative consequences. And that is ongoing work that will be done by the Ministry of Agriculture to make sure that we can build out a specific framework to be able to address genetically modified food and how we'll be able to introduce that in a broader framework into the agricultural system. Completely agree in terms of biodiversity and the bees and the fact that they are disappearing. That's one of the reasons why the government is introducing apiculture and building out apiculture as a viable industry again. And so that is efforts to rebuild. So again, we're starting from the position of deficit, but then we have to then to be able to rebuild as well. And so that we're trying to do that in an extremely strategic strategic way. And finally, Mr. President, I do want to identify that there are concessions that are available to farmers. There is a farmers rebate and incentives program. There is also the Agricultural Development Fund, Mr. President, through which farmers and others within the agriculture sector can go through to access resources, Mr. President. Again, noting that perhaps this is one of the areas that we can review to look at the efficacy and make sure now that it matches the modernization that we have within that context. But also noting as well that farmers can call on the Ministry of Agriculture for the provision of equipment, etc. they do not have, and we will provide those services as well for farmers. Mr. President, as I close, again, let me thank again all of the senators who have contributed to the debate. And I believe that we've sent a clear signal to the population of the importance of this bill, and again, the bill that we debated last week, the Animal Health and Veterinary Public Health Bill, and the fundamental importance of it in two areas. One, to us as individuals and our food security, and also as well to our ability to meet international standards, and therefore potentially, Mr. President, as well, open up export markets for us. Mr. President, I do beg that this bill be read a second time.
The question is that this bill be read a second time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that Your Honour do now leave the chair and the Senate resolve itself into committee for further consideration of this bill.
The question is that they do not leave the chair, and the Honourable the Senate resolve itself into committee for further consideration of this bill. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
The Senate is now in committee.
Madam Chair, this is a long bill, as you realize, seeking the Senate's permission to call in part and clauses.
Go ahead, please.
Part 1, clauses 1 and 2.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Part 1, clauses 1 and 2, stand part.
The question is that Part 1, clauses 1 and 2 do now stand part. Will all those in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against please say nay. The ayes have it.
Part 2, clauses 3 to 16.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Part 2, clauses 3 to 16, stand part.
The question is that Part 2, clauses 3 to 16 do now stand part. All those in favour please say aye. Aye. Those against please say no. The ayes have it.
Part 3, clauses 17 to 27.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Part 3, clauses 17 to 27, stand part.
The question is that Part 3, clauses 17 to 27 do now stand part. Will those in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. The ayes have it.
Part 4, clauses 28 through 31.
Madam President, I beg to move that Part 4, clauses 28 to 31, stand part.
The question is that Part 4, clauses 28 through 31 do now stand part. Will honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against please say nay. The ayes have it.
Part 5, clauses 32 through 44.
Madam President, I beg to move that Part 5, clauses 32 till 44 stand part.
The question is that Part 5, clauses 32 through 44 do now stand part. Will honourable senators in favour please say aye? And those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Part 6, clauses 45 through 49.
Madam President, I beg to move that Part 6, clauses 45 to 49 stand part.
The question is that Part 6, clauses 45 to 49 do now stand part. Will all honourable members in favour please say aye? Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Part 7, clauses 50 to 62.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Part 7, clauses 50 to 62 stand part.
The question is that Part 7, clauses 50 through 62 do now stand part. Will honourable senators in favour please say aye? Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Part 8, clauses 63 to 68.
Madam Chair, I do beg that Part 8, clauses 63 to 68 stand part.
The question is that Part 8, clauses 63 to 68 do now stand part. All honourable senators in favour kindly say aye. Honourable senators against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Report.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that you do now report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee. Will honourable senators in favour please say aye? And those against, please say nay. The ayes have it.
The chairman has reported to me the passing of one bill in committee. Senator Dr. Monroe Knight.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill be now read a third time.
The question is that this bill be read a third time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say nay. I think the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do now pass and be cited as a Plant Protection Act 2023.
The question is that this bill do now pass and be cited as the Plant Protection Act 2023. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. This bill is now passed and so cited. Proceeding. Senator Dr. Moronite.
Mr. President, this brings us to the end of government business. It means that we're actually up to date in terms of the government business before the Senate. But Mr. President, we intend to open up debate on the private members' resolution that was brought by Senator Dr. Charleston Brathwaite.
Clerk will call the order.
Private members' business, sir.
Private members' business.
Order number 1, in the name of Senator Dr. the Honourable C.W. Brathwaite, to resume debate on the passing of a resolution that in light of the global food crisis, that Barbados develop an integrated food security plan which would inter alia reposition the agricultural sector, and that the plan informed by the Agricultural Development Vision of 2012 be reduced to a development document and made available to the Senate.
On the last occasion, Senator Brathwaite, as the mover of the resolution, spoke, and we postponed further consideration. The matter is now open for other senators to make their contribution. Her Honourable Senator Thompson.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I really should like to thank the Honourable Senator for bringing this matter before the Chamber to raise for discussion and critical thinking and analysis what really is a very important issue, because the language of the resolution is so wide that it does allow for a general debate on the issues in agriculture, the social, economic, and development issues, and I hope to touch on some of those during the course of my not long observations today. I start at the point at which the resolution ends, and that is with a call for the Agricultural Development Vision of 2012 to be incorporated and to be reduced. I don't necessarily like the word reduced, but to be crafted into a development document and made available to the Senate. I think, first of all, that as a development document, it needs to be made available to the country. But beyond that, I don't necessarily agree with the call that the 2012 document should be made available as a development document. I think that it needs to be reviewed, revised, and now considered what would be the appropriate development document. Because in the last few years, particularly coming out of COVID, our strategic objectives in relation to agriculture must have changed, and there are lessons that we should have learned about the degree of risk to our agricultural sector, to food and nutrition security that perhaps we did not previously perceive. I do not think that pre-COVID that the world, and indeed the Caribbean, as far as it was from centers of distribution, and high as our food import bill is, I think some $4 million US dollars for the region, that we truly contemplated that there could be intervening events such as COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine, which would so substantially disrupt supply chains and which would have such serious impacts at the centers of production that we could witness the very steep and rapid rises in the cost of agricultural goods, and with knock-on impacts across the food chain and the food supply chain, because there are key staples, wheat, corn. I mean, if you look at food labels, you would be utterly amazed at the number of foods that corn finds itself in, from ketchup to applesauce to a range of goods, of processed foods that we use on a daily basis. So when there's a problem with the corn products, with the corn crops, when corn crops cannot then get to the producers of the added value goods, there is a significant impact on cost, on availability of secondary goods, tertiary goods, and there is a consequential impact on prices in the marketplace, particularly for those of us who, as I indicated before, are far from the centers of production. So I think that in the light of recent geopolitical and geographical events, that we do need to sit down and ask ourselves new questions about the way in which we approach agriculture, agricultural production, agricultural distribution, agricultural policy formulation and implementation, and indeed what our strategic objectives and goals are in the context of the agricultural sector. So I start there as a point of departure, but not disagreement with the Honourable Senator, because of how I see the agricultural sector and the importance to which I am giving it at this time. I want then to make a point in relation, which has been put into the public domain by the Honourable Senator himself, that in the last 5 to 6 years, there has only been one UE graduate per year in the area of agriculture, one Barbadian agricultural graduate per year, or one Barbadian graduate from the Faculty of Agriculture per year, if I'm to be accurate in articulating the position. Mr. President, the Honourable Senator has identified for us what are the serious consequences of this shortage in human resource capacity and training. But I would wish to make the point, and I think that Senator Monroe Knight, without encroaching on the rules, did previously raise this issue, and it is this. In a society that is post-slavery and post-colonial, where agriculture was used to dehumanize Black people, where we were exploited to produce agricultural crops, primary agricultural crops, to which we did not necessarily have full access, and which were then taken to the home bases of the exploiter for the production of secondary and tertiary crops, which were tertiary goods, which were sold back to us. So, for instance, in the Caribbean, we produced raw sugar, but chocolate came back to us, sweetened with our sugar as a high-value good. We produced cocoa, but chocolate came back to us, or Ovaltine came back to us, or Milo came back to us, or even just cocoa as a sweetened good with products sourced in the primary markets of the Caribbean, produced on the backs of persons who were poorly paid, who didn't have the dignity of bathrooms in the fields, who were treated as less than human in the times of slavery, who were in fact regarded, not just treated, regarded and treated as less than human. And then, even in the post-colonial period, their stigmatization of agriculture continued, because let us face it, nobody tells their child you should become a farmer. People drift into farming often when they cannot get anything else to do. Equally, we see a lot of people selling, whether it is eggs, fruit, or vegetables, around the highway now, not because they necessarily are looking to do that as a first career option, but because many of them have lost their jobs, cannot find employment in the marketplace, and in consequence are looking for something to do. And that's exactly what they call it, something to do. They don't regard it as a job or a career. Now, where you have a whole sector that is stigmatized, given the socio-economic and cultural history of the country, how then do you appeal to young people to make agriculture a career of first choice? That really, and this is why I talk about reviewing the policy considerations, because that really is the question. If I was born in poverty in rural Barbados, and I came along seeing my grandmother slaving in the fields and making, as we would say in Barbados, next skin to nothing, and for the purposes of English, sir, and the reporters, making very little money, making pittance for tremendous effort, without the dignity of bathrooms and so on. Why would I want to choose that as a career option? So that as we become more educated, more middle class, and move away from our rural roots, Barbados is very, very urbanized. As we move away from these urban roots, people are also moving away from agriculture. So the fundamental policy issue facing the country is, how do we get young people to choose agriculture as a career? How do we incentivize them? What sort of revenues and salaries do we offer for them to go into agriculture? How do we make land available to them for use? And I know that the Ministry of Agriculture has been increasingly offering land to landless farmers and to young persons and persons generally who want to get into agriculture. But even when they aspire so to do, or even when they voluntarily go into agriculture, they are up against another challenge, another hurdle, and that is the problem of the risk-averse banking system. The banking system in Barbados does not readily offer capital and cash for agricultural production, for agricultural equipment, certainly not to people who look like the majority of us in here. They just don't. And they would argue, and our banking system is very, very risk-averse, very conservative, and they would argue that the risks attendant in agriculture, whether it is pest invasion of your crops, whether it is fungal or other invasions of the crops, or whether it is the invasion of two-footed people into the fields to thief your crops, that it really, the risk to the agricultural production is so high that they cannot guarantee that the farmers can and should repay. And this raises the question of what should be the level of government intervention in the marketplace to ensure not only that land is available, but capital is available. And the necessity for capital increases in a culture where agriculture is now highly digitized, highly technology driven, where we are a water scarce and a water stressed region, and we need to have technologies that are producing high volumes of crops on smaller land spaces without the water intensity as previously used for a range of crops. So there are a number of challenges. If you start at the base level to do the analysis, there are a number of challenges facing those who want to get into agriculture, and a number of disincentives encountered by those who are young in relation to the whole stigmatization of agriculture. So until we address these issues, It is my view that the number of UE graduates will not increase. And equally, the suggestion that we should have a school for agriculture is a great idea if only you could find people to populate it. Because the first thing you have to have is people who are interested to fill the school. The school must be responding to a need. Right now, the need does not exist. There is a necessity from the policy perspective, from the perspective of food and nutrition security, but there is no need from the perspective of demand in the marketplace. And I think that we have to start to address those issues if we are to deal with this matter of young people in agriculture. What returns do farmers get on their crops? If you are not selling high-value agricultural products or livestock like ducks, as I know, or you are not making ribeye, ducks, not dog, ducks. And the Honourable Senator on my left understands that I'm teasing a bit here. If you are not making ribeye steaks available to the hotel sector, if you are not doing the high-yield herbs like cilantro and basil and dill and rosemary, that really, cannabis? We'll get there, yeah. That create high returns. Why would I grow a potato, work hard to reap it, and then get 10 or 15 cents on my potato as the farmer when the supermarket or the person selling alongside the road is making $3 on the potato that it has taken me, I don't know how long to grow, a longer time to grow, to protect it from pests of all sorts, whether the flying, crawling, or walking variety, and then I'm making very little return on it. And when we get to cannabis, though we have high hopes for cannabis, and I remember making myriad speeches in the other place with people laughing at me as to the fact of why we should be studying the cannabis strains across the Caribbean to determine what is the quality, what their quality, and how they could be best be commercialized and so on. Because it was clear to me that we were being set up to get rid of our crops and our industry while it was being nurtured and cultivated for high value elsewhere. And once the legislative enabling was put in place, we would be left without cannabis crops, but other countries would have. And that's it. People used to laugh at me when I made that speech. It has now happened. And I firmly believe that while I hear several Caribbean countries talking about cannabis as a crop for export, for its medicinal value and the production of tertiary medicinal products, the reality is, as we have seen with bananas, as we have seen with the financial services sector, those who live in what they call the first world, who regard themselves as the owners of capital, are going to have a backlash and put restraints into the marketplace, which will seek to retard our growth in this sector in the same way they have. Like I said, bananas, financial services, the implementation of correspondent banking systems, even though there's been no major corruption issue coming out of the Caribbean by comparison with other countries that have not been grey-listed or blacklisted, but that's a whole other issue for another speech. And the reality is true. Because again of our background, people want to go to work looking nice. You go into a restaurant, the young ladies serving you are well-groomed, they have the hair, which we know has cost a lot of money, and the nails are beautifully done. You don't work in the agricultural fields looking like that. You know, you can't wear the short pants, you can't have your nails all perfect and hair. And these things, whether we like it or not, are very much a reality. And there are people, therefore those who are politicians can tell you that people will come to you and tell you, I want help with a job. And when you ask them what kind of job, it is a certain type of job that they think carries a particular look or a particular status. in which they are interested. And agriculture carries neither the look nor the status. And it is all of these perceptions and hurdles that we have to overcome before we can start putting people into the agricultural sector. Indeed, it is critical that we develop an agriculture and climate change plan and policy, because given the gravity of climate change, the intensity and increase in extreme weather events, the dryness and thinness of our soils, the loss of irrigation into the sea, and other climate change related impacts, we absolutely have to have an agriculture and climate change policy which takes cognizance of the worsening situation of climate change and consider what the implications are for those of us in the Caribbean who want to be agricultural producers. And please, for those who think that this is a minor point, up to now, Grenada has not recovered its nutmeg industry. Several countries in the Caribbean which have been affected by hurricanes and severe storms still have to fully rehabilitate the agricultural industry, and there's nothing they can do about it, because a tree or a crop or a plant grows at a particular rate in a particular time frame, then you have to wait to reap, and you have to protect your products in a particular way if you're going to take them to market and so. So climate change and agriculture, and perhaps in 2012 when this policy framework was done, it was not looked at in the same way, but there is now such an important nexus that we cannot ignore it. I've been talking tangentially about hurdles and barriers to agricultural production, and I want to say that the hotel and restaurant sector is a major hurdle for the agricultural industry in Barbados. I have just come back from Dominica. At breakfast on Sunday morning, I was offered herring, green banana, plantain, bakes, cocoa, the old-time cocoa that we would grate, sir. Or, well, they make them now in small balls that you can boil, but there are various methods of production. All of the breakfast, there was bacon, there were no sausages, there were no omelets, there were no pancakes. All of these refined, imported things, everything on the breakfast menu was locally grown produce. And I was at, not at my expense, because you don't know this would become a story, I was at a hotel where the nightly rate was $600 US, and that is what they were serving the guests, and people was mauling it, sir. But you go into hotels and restaurants in Barbados, bacon, sausages, omelets, pancakes, not even locally made pancakes with cassava or breadfruit flour, or, sir, no breadfruit balls. I served for lunch, we were being given dasheen, eddos, tanya. They served something called kush kush. I said, why, can you bring the thing to me? I've never heard of it. I don't know what it looks like. It is related to the Tanya yam and Edo family. It is purple in color. Sir, yam it. Sir, I ate greedily, sir, with great enjoyment, and great enthusiasm. I asked for more. It is a purple root crop. Well, when peeled and cooked, I don't know what it looked raw. It looks like an Edo or, you know, very small yam type cultivar. And then when cooked, it is purple in color and has a similar taste to those root crops, but much more tasty, much more flavorful in my view. With your ribeye steak, you had a choice of mashed tanya and sweet potato fries, not in a package imported from overseas, but made right there. For while they did not serve bread for nibbles, they clearly used a mandolin slicer, sir, and had thin sliced sweet potato with aioli that you could nibble on instead of the imported breads. But you go into a restaurant, whether it is fine dining or any place other than muster, and you would be hard pressed to find a slice of sweet potato, a piece of yam, 2 slices of plantain. You're certainly not getting it at breakfast. You don't find any bakes unless it is goods, is the verb for goods that they have baked. You know, so that what farmers have no incentive to produce. Because where are the outlets? And they tell you, or hotels, the hotel and restaurant sector tell you, that tourists want what they are familiar with. That is the greatest fallacy that we have perpetrated or perpetuated in this country for way too long. Tourists want an immersive experience in the culture of the country. Why is it? Which includes foods. And that is why you can find them at Cuz. That is why you find them in Muster. That is why you would see them at various cook shops that are selling, whether it is at Scotland View or Cambridge. This is why you find them in the various cook shops that are selling Barbadian foods. They want some corn for dessert rather than apple pie. And there's no reason why you can't have both on the menu. People eat corn and ice cream. I think that's a travesty. My point is, when I make it, is to be eaten by itself, eaten and savored, sir. No, you can't be corrupted with any ice cream. But people will eat it. So these things can be put on the menu, creating opportunities for our farmers. But beyond that, exposing Barbadians more and more to the less refined foods, which are far more healthy, are better for us in the context of high blood pressure, diabetes, which is, and the chronic non-communicable diseases, which are a major health problem in our country. In my view, we have the CSME and opportunities for harmonization and so on. And therefore, we should be considering what are the phytosanitary rules and so which we have to meet in order to export these goods, because that is critical. I believe that there are many things that we grow that Barbadians living abroad, whether we freeze conkeys and sell them into the marketplace, Barbadians and Caribbean people living abroad would be happy to access in their markets, particularly in those areas where Caribbean people are known to live in large numbers, Brixton, Brooklyn, and so on. But we aren't doing this. I see now that BADMC or one of the agricultural entities will give you some breadfruit flour, some cassava flour, but in very small quantities. If you are looking at serious cooking or serious baking, you cannot use the quantities or the little packages. You know, these are for sampling and tasting, not really for serious cooking in the household. As a Caribbean, we should be considering what are the niches and the markets that each of us can penetrate. What is your specialization? What is your niche? What is it that you have a competitive advantage in? So that if Barbados is going to produce cassava, say, or sweet potatoes, then Dominica should start looking, given its weather and wet conditions, at producing rice. You know, you have the terraces in Dominica. You have the cool and the wet conditions. Why aren't they growing rice? You have the fact that across the Caribbean, some of us grow various things and can do it very, very well. And that is what we should be looking to trade with each other, to sell among each other, and to export. And unless we can start to address this right, there is going to be a significant problem. Increasingly now, you are hearing on the news issues related to famine in Somalia, predictions of famine in other parts of the world. And as you see these severe shortages of food, as soon as you see countries going into famine, as soon as you see, for instance, that you could not have in major production centers the normal production of crops in the quantities that were experienced. I'm here trying to call to mind, but it is not in the top of my head, that the changing of the policy framework in some country that is a major producer of a staple significant. It is Sri Lankan rice, yes, is a problem, but that's not the one I'm thinking of. Anyway, I didn't plan to make this point, so it isn't in the top of my head. But the fundamental point is that coming out of COVID, people could not get access to things like fertilizer in the same way. And this affects your crop production. They couldn't get access to pesticides and herbicides in the same way because of the disruption of supply chains. And all of this impacts the rate and size and quality of your production and your crop, and in consequence, impacts price and market. We learned in COVID, with the vaccine hoarding by the developed world, that we are not their priority. And if there are going to be food shortages, believe me that they will keep for themselves before we are able to import. Therefore, we must become self-reliant and ask the question, what will it take for us to have food and nutrition security, and start to put those measures in place, and equally to tell tourists when you come out here, you're eating yam and cassava. Fast food restaurants should have sweet potato chips. They should have cassava chips. They should have breadfruit chips instead of breadfruits dropping and spoiling and fruit flies following them. People who have breadfruits selling one in a tray next to the road should be able to sell in commercial quantities to restaurants, so that even if these restaurants cannot meet their full demand for orders for French fries or chips, as we call them, for a day, they can at least meet some of the demand by way of local crops. And there are persons who would ask for breadfruit chips or cassava chips or sweet potato chips over the imported English potatoes. We have to start not just to look at our tastes, but to develop policies and to talk our country through these issues, which are important development issues and have serious socio-economic implications, not just for the now, but for the middle and long term. There is too the fact that we have not used local knowledge well. If you pick up many cosmetics or skincare products, you will see aloe barbadians or aloe barbadians, or I'm not too sure how it is expressed, but sir, what I mean is Bajan aloes. But we aren't exporting any. We aren't cultivating it for export. Our name is tied to it. It is being used tremendously in the pharmaceutical, in the cosmetics, in the healthcare industry, but we are deriving nothing from a product that is carrying our name. These are the things that we need to start to do. We talk about Sarasi bush, but have we tried to commercialize it? Even just if it is just for ourselves or people in the Caribbean, dried Sarasi bush, or Cersei, as Bajans would say, dried Cersei bush that you can boil tea with. I got, coming out of Dominica, dried moringa. We talk about dog dumplings. We heard from Oprah that it was the miracle cure for everything from cancer to erectile dysfunction to hair loss. I haven't tried it for any, sir, but No, and there's some that it would be physically impossible for me to do, even though one might want to offer assistance to friends. But, but sir, the point that I'm making is that the world is calling for products that we grow and disregard, that we pay no attention to, when not only should we be using them, but we should be seeking to cultivate them in quantities from which we can derive economic benefit. I've already made the point previously that I feel we should be seeking to capitalize on sargassum seaweed, whether it is as a byproduct for animal feed, for which we know it is well suited, and that it reduces the incidence of methane and so in the atmosphere because of the digestion of the cows and so on. Or whether we should start to partner with someone, and my view is we should ask Brianna to use it as an input for cosmetics, makeup, and skincare products, for which we also know it is well suited because the research has been done. But rather than treating it as a nuisance and looking for gullies and what do they call them? The places where they dig, so quarries and holes to put it in, if it is going to keep coming in large quantities because of the climate change, then we should be seeking to derive a value from it and to change what is regarded as waste into resource. That's how we make a living. That's how we get innovative and creative. There are countries in the world, whether it is South Korea or Japan or Singapore, that after the World War and these are small countries, small economies that were not as advanced. We're in the same place as we were, which have now far gone past us, where we can use strategies using our agricultural sector to really provide a platform for economic boosting. And if we talk, sir, about issues such as plant protection, and I know that debate just passed, so I will not seek to debate it again, but I will make the point that if we are looking at, because it is important in terms of the agricultural sector, not only the level of loss of our plant species, but the implications for the level of loss. I am going to talk about one which is for beauty more so than food or other purposes, and it is the fact, sir, that as a child growing up, when you walked the street or went into communities, particularly during the holiday season, you saw large quantities of poinsettia growing in people's gardens, and snow on the mountain, which had the most beautiful scent. But you don't see snow on the mountain anymore. I don't see it at all. Please do. Senator Harewood is offering to bring peace for me, and I would be glad, sir, to have a piece by my garden and invite him over the Christmas season to come and sit next to the plant and have a piece of my black cake and pone, made by myself, sir, not bought from the supermarket, made by myself, so that I could show him how well I have utilized the plant that he gave me. But this kind, making those kinds of assessments and having those kinds of audits so that we understand the level of plant loss, what is being lost, why it is being lost, and the implications of the loss is extremely important. Those are two that I mentioned because this is not, I don't know anything about this area from the technical perspective, but certainly from the perspective of a Bajan. And now, sir, you can go and buy potted poinsettias at very high cost, and they don't last long. I mean, they die very quickly. So these are all avenues for revenue earning by persons who want to get into agriculture. There are opportunities for revenue earning in the context of foreign exchange, for Barbados and for the rest of the Caribbean. I think too, sir, that as we are talking about the importation or the export of crops and plants and fruit and vegetables and food and nutrition security, I want to raise with great concern, me personally, sir. First, I want to observe, and I don't know why, that I don't see figs anymore. I don't know why, if there's a problem. I know that papaws, for instance, there was a time when we had the bunchy top, and papaws were adversely affected, so papaw crops were significantly reduced. But what Bajans call figs, the sort of short, fat banana, one does not see them in the market or around the place, or one rarely sees them now. I don't know why, and I think we should start to investigate why that is before, if it is that people are growing less, if there's a pest that is affecting it, and we really need to address that, because before you know it, we will not have fig plants anymore, and we'll have to be importing them too, or we will just not bother to import them. And I personally would find that a loss, Mr. President, because I don't like bananas at all, but I love figs. And there are many fruits and so that you don't see. We could talk about dunks and the urbanization of Barbados. We could talk about akis, though you see more of them than you see dunks. But my concern, sir, is that I have noticed that all of a sudden in Barbados, we are importing the small avocado, I think, the Hass avocado, in large quantities. I do not know why. We have enough avocados on island to satisfy the demand. Local avocados taste far better than a Hass avocado. If you are a licorice person, sir, which you are entitled to be, a local avocado will fill you, when a Hass avocado will mainly titillate the appetite. It will not fill. I do not understand why we are importing these in such large quantities. And you're seeing more of them than you're seeing local avocados. And on top of that, if you do the reading on what is happening in the international marketplace, you will know that there are serious socio-cultural and socio-economic problems in countries where Hass avocados are being produced, where large companies from the developed world have gone into developing countries, pushed traditional farmers and people off of their lands in order to grow these avocados for the export market, and are using local indigenous labor and paying them pittance to work on these farms to produce these mini avocados, for which you have to pay a lot of money. And Barbados should not be a party to the promotion of those kinds of labor practices in the marketplace. I really believe, I do not buy the Hass avocados. I look at them and I quarrel. Well, they don't quarrel back, sir, even though I would wish sometimes that they do, so that I can really feel that I've vented my annoyance. But really, these are things that we need to consider, because I firmly believe that we have to determine what our moral center is going to be at the level of a nation, how we are going to protect labor, even if it is not labor in our country, because the dignity of the human person and allowing people to earn a livable wage that they can look after themselves and their families is critical. And these large companies, if they are allowed to do it and they get away with it, they will not only seek to do it in those countries, they will come to the Caribbean and to Barbados and seek to perpetuate similar practices. I want to close, sir, by making the point that, how much is that? perfect. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Two points then I think I have time for. One is that there was a time when we were less affluent, when we used our plants and our growing plants, our plants and crops more productively. The agricultural sector and farms used hedgerows, they used couscous grass, they use other plants in their soil management techniques, whether it is protecting from pests or managing, holding soils and so on. We do not use these practices anymore. I have no idea why. If it is that indigenous and cultural knowledge has been lost, if we have just gotten higher up and better off and we ain't bothering no more, if it is that we are looking to get all of the agricultural lands to become fallow so that we can sell them for high value housing, I don't know why, but we really need to get back there. Equally, the benefit of bougainvillea hedges and sweet lime hedges to protect boundaries and landscapes, not only in terms of their beauty, but in terms of the fact that they're virtually impenetrable. These are practices to which we need to return if we are talking about protecting our agricultural sectors and really getting farmers employed in activities which will earn revenues. Because if we are just importing poinsettias at Christmas, for instance, that's not benefiting any farmers. But if you can persuade farmers to grow bougainvillea for hedge, or themselves to grow the poinsettias and pot them so that you go to your farm or to your farm shop and pick up locally grown poinsettias, then we are ahead of the game. So really, we truly have to consider our import practices in the context of a broader policy. I'm informed, sir, that our food import bill is 703 million Barbados dollars per annum. This is a huge expenditure. And it is, in my view, the cost of food is rising. People are complaining about how difficult it is to feed a family, how high the prices of various staples and necessities in the supermarket are. And I'm not just talking about cleaning materials, which are exorbitant, but basic foods that you have to have. You cannot be speaking to the issue of a crisis in terms of chronic non-communicable diseases, where more than a quarter of the population has one or more chronic disease, and not be addressing issues of diet and lifestyle. And if you are going to address issues of diet, then that takes you right back to your agricultural policy and the capacity of farmers to make a living by producing food that the country needs and ought to have. But there has to be the marketplace. It is interesting to note, sir, and this is the note on which I would want to end. I went and did some research today because I was curious about the connection, the way in which COVID has impacted agricultural sectors worldwide, and I've spoken to some of it today. The shortages in crops, the shortages of fertilizer, the fact that staples are not being produced, the disruption of supply chains and the consequential impact on prices and so on. It is, they say, a word to the wise is enough. Pre-COVID, 287 million people in the world were facing food and nutrition insecurity. With the impact of COVID, That number has gone up to 349 million people in 79 countries now facing food and nutrition security. Insecurity, beg your pardon, insecurity. Sir, we must not be so naive as to think that that is not happening here in Barbados as well. Because with the loss of jobs, with the impact that COVID had on the tourism market in Barbados and the rest of the Caribbean, because we were our tourism product and hence our economies, since 10 of the 20 most tourism-driven economies, tourism-dependent economies are in the Caribbean. 10 of the world's 20 most tourism-driven economies are in the Caribbean. We were severely impacted because there isn't just the direct tourism impact, but the indirect tourism impact. And part of that indirect tourism impact is on farmers. If there is no market, then there's no point to produce. So that you will find that COVID has seriously impacted food and nutrition security and insecurity in the Caribbean. Now, part of the challenge is that we often don't have data that we can collect, collate, analyze, and then use as a basis for policy projections and policy planning. But let us understand that insofar as that constitutes a trend, it is something of which we have to take cognizance and which we have to factor in to our policy frameworks and planning. Mr. President, sir, as I close then, I thank you very much, Senator. I end as I begin, and that is by commending the Senator, Dr. Brathwaite, for bringing this a private member's resolution that we can start to have a conversation at the national level about the implications of the global food crisis. But I think too that we have to, and the implications for Barbados. But more than the implications, because we're very good at talking about issues from the philosophical and intellectual stimulation perspective, but what are the solutions that we need to put in place to keep Barbados and Barbadians safe, to protect the lives and livelihoods of those who work in the farming industry and the farming sector, and to attract larger numbers, and large numbers of young people into the farming sector. Because unless we can so do, then really what you are going to have is a dying farming industry. As farmers age, as farmers become physically unable to do the work, as they get out of the sector, as predial larceny increases, as we pay little attention to how to protect crops, whether from, I said, 4 or 2-legged pests or winged or walking pests, these will become important considerations. So we cannot talk about food and nutrition security without considering it in the Barbadian context, in the Caribbean context, and certainly in the context of how we find the human resource capacity to build and keep the industry alive and sustainable. With those remarks, I'm much obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Your Honor, Senator Thompson. Senator Monroe.
Mr. President, I want to beg that we suspend further consideration of this private member's bill at this time.
The question is that further consideration on this resolution be postponed. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The things the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that the Senate do now adjourn sine.
The question is that the Senate do now adjourn sine die. All of the senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Accordingly, this sitting is now suspended sine die. Adjourn sine die.